Okay, well, that experiment arose in a very naive way. And what we found was some things that were very, very different from what we expected based on Skinner's data.
Some years ago, you wrote an article with Jinny Sim about superstitious behavior.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think that can be useful already nowadays of that article?
Well, that was a wonderful experience writing that article. Jinny Sim, who didn't graduate with me, she was an undergraduate. She was an undergraduate in what's called the general program at the University of Toronto, which is my first job. And I remember being rather horrified. At Toronto, they had two programs, a general program and an honors program. And the kids in the general program were supposed to be less smart than the kids in the honors program. But Jinny was a wonderful student and a wonderful scientist, a wonderful observer, actually. And so she was my collaborator in that experiment. She left Toronto before graduating, getting her graduate degree, but she did eventually get it. She left to be with her husband. That's what happened. Okay, well, that experiment arose in a very naive way, just to find a project for Jinny to do for her, I think, her master's thesis. And what the question raised was, the original Skinner superstition experiment involved exposing hungry pigeons to a fixed time schedule. That is, they would get free food at periodic intervals, 12 or 15 seconds or so. And the question we wondered was, that was a fixed interval schedule. Suppose we put pigeons on a variable time schedule. So they got free food, but at random intervals. Would you still get superstition? And there was absolutely no theoretical issues involved. I mean, I was just curious to see what would happen. You could make arguments that they should show superstition and arguments that they shouldn't. So the question was to see what we actually got. And what we got, and we did a replication of Skinner's experiment too, as a comparison. And what we found was some things that were very, very different from what we expected based on Skinner's data. In the first place, there was not just a single category of responses that the pigeons showed after they'd had many repetitions of this fixed time schedule. Excuse me, I seem to be sneezing. This is not a reaction to the experiment, I don't think, but it may be. Anyway, so what we found were there are two kinds of activities. There were activities, if we looked at it, and Jinny watched the pigeons very carefully and time tagged every couple of seconds what they were doing. So we had a continuous record of their behavior. It was all observational, nothing automated. And what she found was that early in the interval, they showed a lot of very vigorous behavior. I've got photographs of these pigeons jumping up madly and so on. In the middle of the interval, very vigorous behavior, which they had not shown before. But at the end of the interval, as the time for food approached, they tended to peck something, peck the wall or peck something. So we went over these data and concluded that the behavior was not operant conditioning at all. It was not superstitious behavior. It wasn't superstitious for two reasons. One is the behavior that occurred at the end of the interval was not arbitrary, as Skinner had suggested. It wasn't a random selection from the repertoire. It was an instinctive type behavior, namely pecking. And second of all, a lot of the behavior occurred early in the interval, not contiguous with the reinforcement. So that couldn't be operant conditioning either. And out of this, we we wrote a paper with a couple of paragraphs comparing the situation to a Darwinian variation selection situation. Darwinian model is organisms vary, the successful ones take their mutation into the next generation, and so on and so on. So variation and selection was our model. Well, a very nice thing happened, I'm sure, for rather unlovely reasons. The paper was accepted by the Psychological Review, which was the most prestigious theoretical journal in psychology at that time, probably still is for all I know. But the editor was a man called George Mandler, who was actually a professor at Toronto, but not there that year. I think he was on leave or something. Anyway, he was the editor. And he did something I have literally never encountered from a journal before. He said, why don't you expand your argument? Why don't you make your discussion longer and go into this Darwinian argument? So the paper that was finally published was much longer than our original one. And the experimental part was almost trivial. It was a long theoretical paper on this Darwinian model of operant conditioning. So that's the history of the Simmelhag paper. As I say, she went off, I think, to the University of Newfoundland. My memory's fading. Anyway, she did get a PhD later and had a good career.
Gracias por ver este vídeo, os dejamos por aquí un enlace a nuestra última formación y por aquí algunos vídeos que os pueden resultar de interés. Si estáis buscando ayuda psicológica, también podéis mirar en la descripción del vídeo, donde encontraréis nuestra web y podréis solicitar asistencia terapéutica de un profesional confiable y que os ofrecerá ayuda psicológica basada en evidencia científica.